Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Gavriluk, and I teach historical theology at the theology department here at the University of St. Thomas. On behalf of my department, I am delighted to invite you to this lecture that is a part of our lecture series entitled New Frontiers in Theological Research. We call it that because the intention of this series is to convey the results of serious research in the publicly accessible manner, and that's to say for general public and for our students. And it's my distinct honor today to present Professor Amy Levad, who is Assistant Professor of Theology at my department at the University of St. Thomas, specializing in moral theology. Professor Levad came to St. Thomas after graduate work at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, at Candler School of Theology, and then also in the Graduate Division of Religion of the same university. Professor Levad has worked on theology and ethics of criminal justice for over a decade now. After graduating from the University of Puget Sound, she worked with women arrested for prostitution in Denver, Colorado, as well as offered classes and ministry in the Denver County Jail. While in graduate school at Emory, she was the founding program director of the Certificate in Theological Studies Program in Metro State Prison outside of Atlanta. Sponsored by the Atlanta Theological Association, this particular certificate program both provides women in prison the opportunity to complete a year-long course of theological study, and then also trains volunteers who are engaged in training women who are in prison, trains volunteers, and offers them the possibility to continue their work in divinity and doctoral studies as a part of the same program. And the training that they provide is in prison ministry, activism, and education. Professor Levad currently sits on the board of directors of the Minnesota-based Restorative Justice Community Action Program. Dr. Levad's first book, entitled Restorative Justice, Theories and Practice of Moral Imagination, grew from the ethnographic fieldwork with several restorative justice programs in Colorado and addresses the processes of moral discernment of victims, offenders, and community members as they seek to repair the harm caused by crime. And of course, in these matters, Dr. Levad, when it comes to tackling the questions of restorative justice, speaks also from years of personal experience. Her latest book, which, by the way, is going to be available for sale after her lecture, the title of the book is Redeeming a Prison Society. The subtitle, A Liturgical and Sacramental Response to Mass Incarceration, is also the subject of her talk tonight. Please welcome with me Professor Levad.
Thank you for being here. Caring about people in prison is difficult. We can easily picture incarcerated people as dangerous and dirty, as despicable, as animals in cages. People behind bars are there for good reason, to protect us, law-abiding, tax-paying, upstanding citizens from them. We are better off without these people. Good riddance. I have spoken with many people in my family, classroom, and church who have asked me why I care about people in prison. They seem baffled that anyone would care. Some people even suggest to me that it is wrong to care for people in prison. To them, it seems that extending care to incarcerated people somehow denies the seriousness of their crimes and undermines the rule of law. I do not know whether I would have come to care about people in prison had not someone I already cared about ended up being one of them. While my relationship with my incarcerated loved one had been strained by a long series of disappointments, mostly rooted in her drug use, I could not look at her as dangerous or dirty. I could not despise her. I could not see how the prison protected anyone else from her. Her crime was a nonviolent drug offense, and the person she harmed most was herself. I knew that her family was not better off without her, as I saw her children struggle in poverty and wrestle with the stigmatization and isolation of having a mother in prison. And I saw no way that the prison would better enable her to re-enter society and to do well as a mother, employee, or citizen. My recognition that prison offered nothing in terms of rehabilitation or reintegration into society proved true as years later my loved one's release. She reestablished herself and stopped using drugs, not because of any assistance or guidance from our criminal justice systems, but because of her grit and perseverance alone. Even still, she continues on the edge of poverty, existing always on the edge of survival for her family. Prison did not improve my loved one, her family, her community, or her society. When I came to care about one person in prison, it was difficult for me to remain indifferent to the plight of anyone in prison. I learned quickly that our criminal justice systems are in crisis and that they are tied up with social injustice, poverty, inequality, racism, and ethnocentrism. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, currently over 7.3 million adults in the United States are under some form of supervision, including probation, jail, prison, and parole by state, local, or federal criminal justice systems. At mid-year 2009, 1.6 million people were in prison and nearly 800,000 were in jail. We currently incarcerate people at a rate about 6 times what we did 40 years ago. Although the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, it holds nearly 25% of the world's incarcerated people, according to the World Prison Population List. In short, we have more people locked up in the United States and at higher rates than at any other time in our history and than any other nation. While these numbers are troubling enough to raise serious questions about our criminal justice systems, discrepancies related to race, ethnicity, and class add greater urgency. Black people are incarcerated at a rate 6 times that of white people. Hispanic people at a rate more than 2.5 times that of white people. With these rates, 1 in 3 African American men will be incarcerated during their lifetimes. In addition to racial and ethnic disparities, criminal justice systems in the United States are also marred by disparities related to socioeconomic status. Mark Maurer of the Sentencing Project writes, a 1997 survey of state inmates conducted by the Justice Department, which, by the way, is the most recent survey, found that 68% of prisoners had not completed high school, 53% earned less than $1,000 in the month prior to their incarceration, and nearly 1/2 were either unemployed or working only part-time prior to their arrest. Increasing incarceration hits racial and ethnic minority populations and the poor in the United States especially hard. The current state of our criminal justice systems constitutes mass incarceration, which social theorist David Garland describes as having 2 defining features, the first of which is a rate of imprisonment and a size of prison population that is markedly above the historical and comparative norms for societies of this type. The plight of young, poor Black men reveals that our society also fulfills the second feature. Imprisonment becomes mass imprisonment when it ceases to be the incarceration of individual offenders and becomes the systematic imprisonment of whole groups of the population. For young Black men in large, impoverished urban centers, imprisonment has become normalized. It has come to be a regular, predictable part of experience rather than a rare and infrequent event. The typical life events of the young, education, military service, employment, marriage, have been circumscribed by the prison. A naive assessment of the reasons behind the advent of mass incarceration in the United States might assume that we incarcerate more people because more people are committing crime in our society. This assumption is countered by two important pieces of evidence. First, while the United States rates of incarceration are much higher than all other nations, our rates of crime do not differ significantly from other similar countries. Although the United States is exceptional in its levels of lethal violence, probably due to relatively lax gun control laws, rates of non-lethal violence, property crime, and drug offending in the United States are comparable to rates in other Western industrialized democracies. Some of these nations, such as the United Kingdom, Ireland, New Zealand, and Iceland, have higher rates of crime overall. Nevertheless, incarceration rates in the United States exceed those of all of these nations to a staggering degree. Second, the growth of incarceration rates over the last 40 years has not coincided with increasing crime rates. While the beginning of our increased use of prisons may have reflected higher crime rates in the early 1970s, Maurer notes a steadily increasing prison population has twice coincided with periods of increase in crime and twice with declines in crime. The most dramatic decline began in the early 1990s and has persisted for the last 20 years. Criminologists Alfred Blumstein and Alan Beck found that only 12% of the tripling of the national prison population between 1980 and 1996 can be explained by changes in crime rates, a greater likelihood of incarceration upon conviction, and longer prison terms explain the remaining 88% of growth. A protest remains against this second body of evidence. Rather than examining crime data for the US population in aggregate, this protest avers that we must look at the offending rates of poor young Black men. The growth in incarceration rates could be explained and legitimate if this sector of the population alone engaged in more crime than they used to do. For this protest to have merit, this population today must commit more crime than previous generations. Data from the National Longitudinal Surveys of Youth, however, show that this is not true. Between 1980 and 2000, violent crime among poor Black male youth dropped 21%, property crime dropped 68%, and drug dealing dropped 69%. Rather than increasing crime among African American men and boys, most of the growth in incarceration rates since the 1970s is due to the greater likelihood that someone would receive a prison sentence for a drug crime, and that his prison sentence would be longer than it would have been in the past. Rates of arrest of young Black men for drug crimes far exceed their actual involvement in them. This disparity, along with more punitive sentencing, explains a significant proportion of growing racial disparities in our incarceration rates over the last 40 years. Against the protest that we incarcerate more people, especially young, poor Black men and boys, because they are committing more crimes, these data instead indicate that we incarcerate more people because we have become more willing to throw more people in prison for longer periods of time than we as a society used to be. If high rates of crime cannot explain mass incarceration in the US, then we must look for other causes. The actual causes are myriad. David Garland observes, mass imprisonment was not a policy that was proposed, researched, costed, debated, and democratically agreed. America has drifted into this situation without anyone pausing to assess the overall outcome. Behind mass incarceration are factors such as the concentration of poverty, growing economic inequality, unemployment, inadequate health care, especially mental health care, lack of accessible quality drug and alcohol treatment, racial and ethnic discrimination, and failing educational systems. Fertilized by economic shifts with the deindustrialization of inner cities, a cultural sense of social disorder from the 1960s, the politicization of crime, and a move away from rehabilitation and criminology, these factors sprouted policy decisions such as the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes sentencing, prison privatization, the end of parole, loss of rehabilitative programs, get tough measures such as chain gangs and prison camps, and stricter sentencing guidelines. In short, the roots of mass incarceration lie in a bed of social injustice. In turn, locking up ever more people in our country exacerbates social injustice. While mass incarceration has contributed only a small amount to falling crime rates since the late 1990s, it has worsened conditions in neighborhoods that see many of their residents cycle in and out of prison. Prisoners and their families and their communities experience greater levels of poverty, unemployment, political exclusion, and social isolation, as well as potentially even higher crime rates. Our society as a whole cannot invest in resources such as education, healthcare, drug treatment, or jobs programs because our tax dollars are diverted into criminal justice systems. According to the Vera Institute, it cost $41,364 to incarcerate one person for 1 year in Minnesota. To put that number in perspective, tuition at the University of St. Thomas is $35,872 per student per year. My students are really frustrated right now. When we put our money into incarcerating people, we cannot put our money toward other goods and services. There is an opportunity cost to incarceration that our entire society bears. Mass incarceration wreaks havoc on the common good. As a result, any adequate response to mass incarceration must not only provide resources for addressing crime and individual wrongdoing, it must also attend to the connections between criminal and social justice. To untangle our criminal and social justice crises, we must begin by learning to care about people in prison. Insulated by racial, ethnic, and class privilege, many Americans can live most of our lives without awareness of the harsh realities surrounding mass incarceration and the ways in which many people in prison have been degraded and demeaned throughout their lives. To overcome our indifference toward people in prison and to begin to address the problem of mass incarceration, we must come to care across racial, ethnic, and class divisions and to recognize that people in prison are indeed human persons. We must also begin to envision a new kind of society that is not so willing to throw people away, especially people who have already been pushed to the edges of our communities. As I turned this problem over in my heart and my head, and as I contemplated my Catholic heritage, which had taught me to be open to and forgiving of the other, no matter how difficult that might be, I found guidance in the heart of our tradition, the sacraments and liturgy. I maintain that liturgical and sacramental ethics may offer a foundation for a Catholic response to mass incarceration. Such a response might both provide a social critique of those factors that have contributed to criminal justice crises and a framework for holding individuals accountable for their wrongdoing. To begin describing this foundation, liturgy and the sacraments ought to be understood expansively, not only as the words and gestures of the Mass or the list of 7 sacraments. Based on the Greek liturgia, the liturgy is the public service of the Church in making the grace of God perceptible to human beings, thus consecrating our lives in the world. Sacramentality is the idea that everything is, in principle, capable of embodying and communicating the divine. With the belief that everything has a potential to reveal God, Catholics also maintain that Jesus Christ, who is the ultimate sacrament, instituted specific, tangible signs of God's grace, disclosing the hidden reality of salvation in the world. Sacraments consecrate our lives and form who we are as followers of Jesus Christ. Through participation in the sacraments in our liturgy, Catholics believe that we are drawn into the compelling love of Christ, and that we are set on fire as grace is poured forth on us. The formative character of the sacraments suggests that our sacramental lives ought to relate to our moral lives. The disclosure of the hidden reality of salvation in the world, the revelation of God's grace through a sign instituted by Jesus Christ, influences our perceptions of reality, and our new perceptions influence how we act in response to the challenges of the world. The vision of salvation and grace disclosed through this liturgy of the sacraments helps us, The vision of salvation and grace disclosed through the liturgy of the sacraments helps us to envision the world, ourselves, and our neighbors as God does. The liturgy of the sacraments draws us more deeply into the world in anticipation of the ultimate mystery of God's reign. One aspect of the moral formation of the sacramental life is that we are called to seek God's justice in the world as we witness the inbreaking of God's reign in our own time and place. In this way, sacramentality, morality, and the pursuit of justice are linked together. This more expansive understanding of liturgy and sacraments, while rooted in Catholicism, should be accessible to other Christian traditions as well. The liturgy of the sacraments provides a starting point in Catholic tradition for theological and moral reflection about justice. Specifically, the Eucharist offers a framework for our critiques of social injustice. As the Eucharist grounds practices of penance and reconciliation, these sacraments also provide a model for our responses to individual wrongdoing, and thus resources for examining criminal justice. With respect to individual wrongdoing, we must acknowledge that despite the injustices of mass incarceration, criminal behavior cannot be tolerated. However, how we ought to respond is not always obvious. While I do not want to recommend these practices straightforwardly as a model for our criminal justice systems, I do believe that the sacrament of penance and reconciliation can offer some guidance for discerning how to respond to both individual wrongdoing and social injustice. The history of the sacrament suggests that it is best to understand individual wrongdoing not in legalistic terms as the violation of the law, but as a violation of relationships. Practices of penance and reconciliation emphasize that sin harms the whole community and so, in some ways, requires a communal response. Even private confession suggests that one is accountable not only to God, but also to the church community represented by the confessor. People who commit wrongdoing must work to correct the harms they have done to community members. At the same time, community members ought to provide guidance and relationship in order to restore the wrongdoer to full communion. Some punishment may be necessary, such as penitential works. However, the purpose of punishment ought not be to inflict pain, but to transform the character of the wrongdoer. It should be medicinal, restoring the wholeness of the wrongdoer. Some separation from community may be necessary for a time, but the primary goal is reintegration of the offender into the community. Christians are ultimately called to extend forgiveness to wrongdoers. The reason for forgiveness is that we recognize our solidarity in sinfulness and appreciate the forgiveness already extended to us through Jesus Christ. Based upon our experience of forgiveness, the church, the reconciled community, becomes a reconciling community. In response to individual wrongdoing, the example of this sacrament upholds the importance of seeking reconciliation above all else. Underlying these insights into how to respond to individual wrongdoing is an assumption about the agency and status of wrongdoers. Because the sacrament of penance and reconciliation is oriented toward reconversion and reintegration into the community, those people undergoing penance must have some capacity to turn themselves toward the good in response to God's grace. Theologian Bruce Hidber observes, in one's rapport with God, the person must never be reduced to an object to be controlled, even when one presents oneself as a sinner who has betrayed freedom. Rather, one is to be treated as one disposed to conversion. The practices of penance and reconciliation suggest that even wrongdoers ought to be treated as active moral agents who can be guided toward the good, and that they ought to be treated as brothers and sisters within their communities. In light of the moral vision of penance and reconciliation, Catholics and other Christians might have affinity for criminal justice systems that emphasize restorative justice and rehabilitation rather than retribution. Restorative justice includes a variety of practices that bring together victims, offenders, and community members to reach consensus about how to repair the harm caused by a crime. Among the points of connection between the sacrament of reconciliation and restorative justice is first the emphasis on the communal context of wrongdoing. For both penance and reconciliation and restorative justice, wrongdoing is seen as a harm done to other persons and to the communities in which we live. Both practices also aim toward restoration of all members of the community and toward the continuation of relationship in ways that enable all persons to flourish. Neither advocates retribution or punishment for the sake of punishment. Rather, both insist upon wrongdoers taking responsibility for their actions and making things right as much as is humanly possible. Practices of penance and reconciliation and restorative justice endeavor to hold people accountable while challenging them to change their lives, to reject vengeance, to reach out to victims, and to restore a sense of community. Recognizing the connections between this sacrament and restorative justice may encourage Catholics and other Christians to support efforts to implement restorative justice in our criminal justice systems, and perhaps even to get involved in restorative justice programs in their communities, like Restorative Justice Community Action. The medicinal understanding of penance and reconciliation may also serve as a basis for supporting rehabilitative efforts within criminal justice systems. We must remember that the purpose of penance is the restoration of wrongdoers to healthy and whole communion with the body of Christ. The acts of satisfaction in penance are not to be understood as punishments for the sake of punishment, but as regimens for retraining oneself in the ways of Christ. This interpretation of punishment as having a medicinal value is echoed today in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which states that, as far as possible, punishment should contribute to the correction of the offender. In many ways, penitential regimens may be thought of as analogous to rehabilitative efforts to facilitate healthful change in the behaviors and attitudes of criminal offenders. Rehabilitative practices that serve these purposes can then be supported within a Catholic sacramental framework. However, this framework would also challenge advocates and practitioners of rehabilitation to ensure that the full human agency of offenders is recognized and respected. This is a big problem within the history of rehabilitation. In the words of biblical scholar Christopher Marshall, too often with rehabilitation, the offender is treated as an infant to be socialized or even as an animal to be trained, rather than as a rational, self-directed, morally culpable individual. Certain models of rehabilitation, such as the Good Lives model promoted by criminologists Tony Ward and Shad Maruna, however, can mitigate these problems to fit within a Catholic framework for responding to crime and individual wrongdoing. Reading this book is kind of like reading Augustine. It's not terribly different. Both restorative justice and rehabilitation require the active participation of offenders who admit their wrongdoing, take responsibility, and desire change in their lives. Of course, not every person who commits crime will meet these criteria, so we will continue to need prison in our society, although in a much reduced role. Catholics and other Christians must ask, however, whether prisons are fully consonant with our values, or whether we ought to admit that prisons reflect a tragic failure to achieve reintegration and reform of wrongdoers through other means. In their 2001 statement on criminal justice, responsibility, rehabilitation, and restoration, The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops recognize a role for incarceration in our criminal justice systems, but remind us that where incarceration is necessary, it is never a sufficient response to criminal offenders. They write, "Not all offenders are open to treatment, but all deserve to be challenged and encouraged to turn their lives around." Our calls for criminal justice reform must be viewed through a sacramental lens that fosters restoration and rehabilitation, while calling for a significantly reduced role for incarceration. Criminal justice reform in the United States, however, cannot remain narrowly focused on individual level responses to crime and wrongdoing, given the broader social context of mass incarceration. A liturgical and sacramental response must entail work for social justice, and this work requires a change in our consciousness surrounding issues of race, ethnicity, poverty, and crime in the United States. Even if we created a criminal justice system based on rehabilitation and restorative justice, even if we made prisons much better places, we would not have addressed the factors that fostered mass incarceration, and we would probably be doomed to recreate mass incarceration in the long run. Furthermore, it is doubtful that we could achieve these proposals without first feeling convicted about the need to do better at ensuring that everyone in our society has access to conditions that enable them to experience full human dignity. We need to begin to care deeply about the ways in which many people in our society are subordinated and degraded, and we need to care deeply across lines of race, ethnicity, and class. Dismantling mass incarceration requires not only policy reform, but more fundamentally, reform of our consciousness about what makes a good person, a good community, a good society, amidst racial, ethnic, and class differences. The sacrament of penance and reconciliation offers some resources for discerning how to respond to broader social injustices. If we recognize social injustice as the product of social sin, then we might discern how reconciliation could help us seek redemption from the oppression in which we participate. A patristic era ceremony described by theologian Monica Hellwig may provide a precedent for practices that enable the broader community to accept at least some responsibility for the wrongdoing of their neighbors. In this ceremony, bishops, clergy, and congregations would prostrate themselves weeping before penitents to acknowledge their failure to support community members who have sinned. The church was united in sinfulness, but also in the work of redemption. Everyone was responsible for reconciliation and the transformation of sinful lives. If sin extends beyond personal sin, then the reconciling work of the church ought also to extend beyond private confession. And in our private confessions, we ought to acknowledge the ways in which we have each been complicit in social sin. Of course, conversion requires we turn away from our past lives. So in practices of penance and reconciliation in response to social injustices, we must discern prophetic responses for changing these circumstances, altering our own character and that of wider society. Penance and reconciliation finds its ultimate ground in another sacrament, the Eucharist. And I argue that for Catholics, the reform of consciousness needed to dismantle mass incarceration ought to be rooted within our participation in the Eucharistic table. An examination of the New Testament texts that describe the institution of the Eucharist by Jesus Christ and its celebration in early Christian communities reveals the connections between this sacrament and justice. During the Last Supper, Jesus drew his disciples together and offered to them bread and wine, his body and blood, telling them of his death and resurrection for the forgiveness of sins. His celebration of the Last Supper fulfills the covenant established with Israel for the reconciliation of all creation with God and provides a foretaste of the reign of God in its fullness. It also brings to mind the numerous other meals described in the Gospels, in which Jesus included at his table people who were excluded from society and whom he would welcome in God's reign. Jesus instructs his disciples at the Last Supper to become servants of others so that they may receive the kingdom of God. Following Jesus' death and resurrection, the early Christian community endeavored to do this in remembrance of him, a convicted and crucified criminal, through the celebration of the Eucharist as a communal meal. The New Testament accounts of the Last Supper and early celebrations of the Eucharist indicate that through the ongoing practice of this sacrament, Christians remembered Jesus' victory over the principalities and powers of this world by coming together as a community and reaching out to all those who are excluded and sharing with them all that one has, thus embodying God's justice. The description of the Eucharist in New Testament texts highlight a tension within its celebration. As we partake in the Eucharist in the present moment, we are called to remember Jesus Christ's death and resurrection in the past and to anticipate the coming of the reign of God in fullness in the future. Theologian William Cavanaugh describes this experience of the Eucharist as producing a desire for what is not yet amidst what has already come with Jesus Christ. He writes, "If the Eucharist is indeed a memorial of the whole Christ, then it recalls more than the past events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but also expresses an ardent longing for the completion of the kingdom Christ inaugurated. Through participation in the Eucharist, Christians glimpse God's reign in which life overcomes death, peace conquers violence, sin is forgiven, all of creation is reconciled, the covenant is fulfilled, and God's love and justice reign. We find hope in the body of Christ. We see the world as it could become fully in the reign of God, and we recognize the extent to which our world remains fallen. Within the Eucharist, we experience the reality of brokenness and a hope for a wholeness. The tension between the already and the not yet in the Eucharist is the source of the ardent longing described by Cavanaugh for God's life, peace, forgiveness, love, and justice. This longing is not otherworldly, not an individualistic escape from our troubles. Rather, the Eucharist is bodily, communal, and political. The celebration of the Eucharist, theologian Kevin C. Soltz writes, implies deep confrontation with human alienation. He continues, in our contemporary world, there are many who are lowered by society. Those who are thought to be unworthy or inferior are pushed lower and lower in the community until their own sense of dignity and worth is decimated too. Christian ministry to these people must be ministry and service after the manner of Jesus. The very ones who are pushed or kept down by society are the ones to be raised up so they achieve that sense of dignity and worth essential to the redeemed human condition. As the Eucharist fosters visions of God's justice, Christians ought to become increasingly aware of injustices in our midst that demean and degrade our neighbors, and ought to be inspired to work for redemption, healing, and inclusion for all people. For Catholics and many other Christians, we enter into a vision that holds these ideals before us every time we come to the Eucharistic table. In communion with one another, we experience a transformation of consciousness to recognize the dignity of all human beings and to care across lines of race, ethnicity, and class. This transformation ought to draw us into confrontation with our failures of criminal and social justice. Because of the moral vision of the Eucharist, Catholics must move beyond criminal justice reform in how we deal with individual offenders to address the social injustices that are created and are sustained by mass incarceration. We could begin by advocating for the end of policies such as the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing, 3-strike sentencing, prison privatization, the end of parole, loss of rehabilitative programs, get tough measures such as chain gangs and prison camps, and stricter sentencing guidelines. But we must do more. We must attend to the concentration of poverty, growing economic inequality, unemployment, inadequate health care, especially mental health care, lack of accessible quality drug and alcohol treatment, racial and ethnic discrimination, and failing educational systems. Some of the following recommendations are already begun by Catholics, other Christians, or non-religious activists, but they could be strengthened and developed further. Beginning with poverty, economic inequality, and unemployment, jobs programs could provide suitable vocational training. In addition, the federal bonding program, which offers insurance to employers who take a risk in hiring ex-offenders, could be expanded. Campaigns to ban the box on employment applications that requires applicants to disclose criminal backgrounds early in the application process have been successful in many locations. In 2012, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission recommended banning the box as a best practice for considering criminal records in employment decisions. More employers ought to consider banning the box and remaining open to hiring ex-offenders. A strong social safety net can provide necessary support for people trying to find and keep employment. People convicted of felony drug crimes lost access to welfare benefits and food stamps with the 1996 welfare reform laws. Other laws passed in 1996 and 1998 further limit access to public housing for people with criminal records. The 1994 crime bill abolished prisoner access to Pell Grants, and people convicted of felony drug crimes can no longer receive federal financial aid, which is probably paying for a large number of you to sit here tonight, for higher education, even after release from prison. These short-sighted policies deny people exiting our criminal justice systems access to useful resources for restarting their lives. Rather than promoting dependency, easier access to education, housing, food, and other basic resources can make the key difference in enabling someone to get a job and stay in it. Finding and keeping employment may then empower ex-offenders ultimately to escape poverty, as well as cycles of recidivism. Families of prisoners need more support. While we must allow that the separation of abusive and neglectful parents from their children may be necessary, most children experience the imprisonment of their mother or father as a traumatic event that can lead to lowered self-esteem, depression, emotional withdrawal, inappropriate or disruptive behaviors, or the inability to form attachment to others. One of the strongest predictors of whether someone will end up in prison is whether they had a parent in prison. The families of incarcerated people also often experience worsened poverty while their loved one is in prison and after release, as these families have lost a financial contributor and as ex-prisoners find it difficult to re-enter the labor market. Families may face stigma and isolation from others, as well as humiliation, shame about their situations. Parenting classes for people in prison, increased visitation access, less expensive collect phone calls, and counseling for all family members could foster healthier relationships that better enable prisoners to re-enter their families and communities. Beyond prison walls, the needs of families must be better addressed. To address these needs, religious organizations and congregations should work toward becoming what the Annie E. Casey Foundation has called healing communities. These communities become places that welcome returning citizens from prison and support their families. They actively seek to address the shame and stigma associated with the incarceration of a family member, and they begin working with people who are incarcerated before their release and continue through the reentry process, including offering mentoring services. The program for healing communities is built on the premise that any church can, and every church should, become a community that embraces the returning citizen and his or her family. It ought not matter whether a religious congregation or organization is large or small, rich or poor, white or black, Catholic or Protestant, Christian or not, it has some capacity to offer material, emotional, social, or political support to people who are incarcerated, returning citizens, and their families. Communities must also be made safer, but we cannot ensure safety by locking up all the criminals. We've tried that. unsuccessfully. We need new models of policing that do not alienate already marginalized communities, that offer protection for their residents, that draw upon and build up community resources, that do not result in high rates of incarceration in poor minority neighborhoods, and that stop crime, or at least the variety of crimes that keep people from letting their kids play on the street. Since the late 1990s, two overlapping models of policing under the moniker of pulling levers policing have been devised that seem to meet these ends. Pulling levers policing is really complicated, so I'm not going to explain it now. But if you want to ask the question, I'd be happy to talk about it more. With pulling levers policing, gun violence can be stopped and drug markets can be closed without stop and frisk, without zero tolerance, and without increased incarceration. With safe communities, we can create healthier communities, and we can begin with better schools. We must break the tie between schools and prisons that the Children's Defense Fund calls the cradle-to-prison pipeline. The Harlem Children's Zone, a nearly 100-block neighborhood project in New York, has been successfully building a cradle-through-college-to-community pipeline in opposition to the concentrated poverty and incarceration experienced by neighborhood residents. Through prenatal care, parenting classes, preschools, summer and after-school programs, health and dental clinics, academic case management, mentoring programs, drug and alcohol treatment, and college support for first-generation college students, the Harlem Children's Zone is ensuring that all residents, but especially children, can experience the dignity, unity, and equality due to every human person. This organization is now a model for Promise Neighborhoods, a federal initiative through the U.S. Department of Education that has given nearly $100 million in grants to local-led efforts to improve educational opportunities and provide comprehensive health, safety, and support services in high-poverty neighborhoods, including one in North Minneapolis. Catholics and other Christians could easily participate in any of these endeavors to address the social injustices that have contributed to and are sustained by mass incarceration. To do this, we need lawyers, doctors, nurses, social workers, mental health professionals, police officers, judges, business people, educators, clergy, politicians, and parents. In short, we need the people of God, the body of Christ. Imagine what could happen if we, as the church, mobilized our resources from the local parish up through the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Imagine the roles that could be played by Catholic schools, hospitals, charities, and universities. Imagine if we participated in multiracial, cross-class, and interreligious coalitions that cultivated a vision of society in which all human beings of all races are treated with dignity and have the right to food, shelter, health care, education, and security, in the words of civil rights attorney Michelle Alexander. Imagine if these coalitions became the seedbed for a movement to dismantle mass incarceration. Imagine what we could do if we took as our food for this work the body of Christ, the Eucharist. As Catholics seek ways to contribute to resolving our criminal and social justice crises, we ought to draw on the heart of our tradition, liturgy and sacraments. Most Catholics in the United States will not ever have a loved one in prison, an experience that can pique one's conscience about the problems of mass incarceration. Let's be honest, most will not read the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Statement on Criminal Justice. Realistically speaking, most will not be moved by an intellectual appeal to liturgical and sacramental ethics. But Catholics will be shaped by their participation in liturgy and sacraments. The experience of God's grace disclosed in the Eucharist is the most important experience in our lives as individual Christians and as the gathered church. As we partake of the Eucharist, we are called to discern our consciences about the ways in which we continue to participate in broken relationships and to seek reconciliation through the sacrament of penance. If Catholics are to come to stand for an end to our criminal and social justice crises, they will do so because of the vision of justice in God's reign conveyed by liturgy and sacraments. We must begin our work for justice by seeing it as integrated within the liturgical and sacramental heart of Catholicism. As our consciousness is transformed by participation in liturgy and sacraments, we must envision a new kind of society. If we are to come to care about all persons through our experience of the Eucharistic table, then we cannot be content any longer with a society that takes seriously, that was an important line not to skip. Then we cannot be content any longer with a society that is willing to throw people away. We must endeavor to create a new society that takes seriously the inviolable and inalienable dignity of every human person. We must ensure that our society serves the good of all people. We must commit ourselves to the common good, a good that ultimately excludes no one. And we must be willing to dismantle any structures, including prisons, that impede the realization of this vision. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the mind-stirring lecture. We will now have time, about 20 minutes for Q&A, and we will also have microphones available in both aisles. Also, if you're interested in the lecture series itself and would like to be on our distribution list, there are also sign-up sheets outside of the auditorium for you subsequently after the end of today's talk. So this side and that side, so start Q&A.
Hi.
Hi, Lindsay.
Okay, so my question was, so if you suggest earlier in your talk, you were saying that prisoners could try to heal their wrongdoing through penance and reconciliation. What would you suggest for non-Catholic people who are incarcerated?
Right, so a good friend of mine who works in prisons in Pennsylvania reports that penance and reconciliation is the favorite sacrament of all the prisoners that she works with, but that's not suitable for everybody. There's also other prison programs that are faith-based, which in principle are good. The issue is if that's the only form of prison programming, then that's a problem, because you shouldn't have to make a conversion in order to be able to receive these services. Restorative justice in itself doesn't require any sort of faith commitment. It's in its roots was started by a Mennonite, a couple of Mennonites in Ontario, Canada in the 1970s, but there's nothing about it that requires any sort of faith commitment. In talking with people who participate in restorative justice and talking about their religious backgrounds, people come to it from all sorts of commitments, many from no commitment at all. But one thing that I found interesting in talking to numerous people is that almost everyone describes the experience of restorative justice as a sacred experience. So it doesn't necessarily, in a script of a restorative justice program, it doesn't mention God at all, but it has the similar sorts of practices that can work well in a variety of settings. There's a question over yonder. Where do I get my passion from? So, yeah, so I'm kind of defending criminals. Yeah, I am. I own that. And part of this is that I've known some criminals in my life. You all have probably known some criminals in your life as well. They just may not have gotten caught. Let's be fair. At the same time, I care about criminals because that's what's required by a commitment to a belief that every human being bears the image of God. That you can't get rid of that. There's nothing that you can do to get rid of the image of God. And the image of God requires us to respect all other people. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we ignore the consequences for wrongdoing. And it certainly doesn't mean that we ignore the situations of victims. One of the biggest problems with our current criminal justice systems is victims don't matter unless they can be offering testimony against assailants. But if you can't offer testimony, you don't count. One of the things that I see with restorative justice is that it cares about the image of God born not only by the offender, but also by the victim, and works to restore the victim as well as the offender to full communion with the broader society. Yeah, I care about criminals.
Dr. Levad, my question, well, so there are a variety of terms for a similar stream of thought in the Christian tradition. I'm not going to be able to say it now. Apokatastasis, there we go. Reconstitution, movement towards the resurrected state. And what I'm wondering is how, in a restorative justice setting, that topic can be brought into conversation, and how we can look at restoration as, in some ways, reconstitution, if at all.
Talking about sort of a sense of ontological reconstitution? Yeah. Insofar as the fullness of the resurrection is a state of perfect reconciliation, I think restorative justice provides a step towards that, but I wouldn't say that it necessarily achieves even reconciliation. It's a step towards that. Restorative justice advocates are careful to say that forgiveness can happen in restorative justice, but forgiveness is not the purpose of restorative justice. The purpose of restorative justice is to repair the harm caused by crime, to identify those harms, and to come up with strategies for addressing them. In some circumstances, those harms cannot be repaired, but restorative justice tries to go as far as possible. If forgiveness happens, if reconciliation happens, that's a bonus with restorative justice. It's not a necessary feature. But does that address your question somewhat? We can talk about it more. There's a question here and there. So maybe, yeah.
Can you explain the pulling levers strategy?
Yes. So this is totally cool. If you want a fast read that describes it well, I recommend David Kennedy's Don't Shoot. But he works in Boston and his last name's Kennedy, so if you just Google Kennedy in Boston, you're not going to get this. But pulling levers policing started by addressing gun violence in Boston with a project called Project Ceasefire. And the observation was that most people who are involved in violent altercations involving firearms are young and easily identifiable, that it's just a handful of folks who are involved in it. With pulling levers policing, you do a lot of work ahead of any sort of arrest. As a police force, with the district attorney's office, with the courts, by identifying the different gangs and youth groups that are involved in the most violent altercations. And you target the group that is involved in the most violence, but you don't necessarily arrest them. You keep a tally of all the other stuff that they're doing. And you create a dossier that shows all the other stuff that they're doing. One of the features of these young groups is that they are operating in a constant state of fear. In interviewing these young men who are involved in these altercations, you'll ask, so have you ever been shot at? And they'll say, oh no, I've never been shot at. I mean, the guy next to me was shot at, but I wasn't shot at. And that's a sort of thin line that most of us aren't willing to make. Like, if the guy next to me gets shot at, I'm getting shot at. So they're living in constant fear, and they have a sense that nobody cares if they die, which is fairly accurate. So after collecting these dossiers of wrongdoing, they sit down with the most violent gang and say, this is everything we have on you. And if you are involved, if any one of you is involved in any sort of violent altercation, then we will arrest all of you for everything that we have here. So they know that the stakes are high and that people are watching them. That also focuses the energy of the police on one relatively small group of people. The other thing that's communicated is that if any one of you is harmed, we will treat your assault, your death, as equivalent to the assault or death of a police officer. So they have the sense that someone cares about whether they live or die and that they'll be protected. The message is sent to other gangs so that they know not to be violent against this particular group. And pretty soon, that is within days, gun violence stops. And no one was arrested. No one went to prison. You got a lot of front action work that you have to get a lot of people together in a very effective coalition. And if you have a dysfunctional city government, it's not going to be easy to do. Works really well in Boston, bombed in Baltimore, which if you watch The Wire, you know why. But that's one way to shut down gun violence. There's also other measures to address overt drug markets. Because one of the problems with arresting people for selling drugs is if you're just arresting the guy who's standing on the corner slinging drugs, there's an open market for somebody else to come sling drugs in the same place. So you have to be very creative about how you don't just ensure that you're moving drug dealer after drug dealer after drug dealer to the same spot. Yeah.
I just would like to note that me as a black male, I grew up really poor in in the South, and moving up to Minnesota into a shelter. I really saw the dynamics of oppression and how it influenced black people to act in a certain behavior. And then also seeking a degree in criminal justice, I went off into a field where I was working at the Stillwater Correctional Facility.
Mm-hmm.
And me working at the Stillwater Correctional Facility was a huge conflict of interest for me due to the fact that the majority of the people that I knew there that I grew up with were black, and they had somehow put themselves in a situation where they had been incarcerated. I don't look at myself any different from them. We all bleed blood and we breathe the same air, all that good stuff. So those people that I saw that were incarcerated, I really did feel sad for them because I knew the plight of their experiences and what they had probably been through, and what led them to that point in their life where they were incarcerated. I think that it's a huge issue to feel like the system is a threat to your survival. When you show those statistics of black men being incarcerated, to me, I perceive the system as a threat. I don't think I don't have anything against the system. I was in the military for 13 years, but I do perceive them as a threat due to the facts that are out there. Mm-hmm. And it clearly states that I'm a target, and they're looking to incarcerate Black men. Just to be quite frank. And I think that is very great that you're taking a political and social stance to help try to alleviate some of that, alleviate some of the oppression and stuff like that. And I wanted to thank you for that too.
Thank you. Something that got skipped over a little bit when editing for time is that the rates of offending of African American men are really no different than anybody else. Especially the crimes that have led to mass incarceration, because they're the ones that we've punished more with drug crimes. If you look at the rates of drug use, it's exactly the same, regardless of race. If you look at who's selling drugs, it's exactly the same, regardless of race. The difference is, if you're poor and African American and selling drugs, you're probably doing it on a street corner. If you're white and well off, you're doing it out of your locker at school. You all know who that kid was. And he probably didn't get arrested. And the difference was that he was insulated by privilege. And that's where we have to pay attention to this overlap of race and class. And we're seeing the problems of over-policing and of a punitive criminal justice system in Ferguson. And recognizing that people are done with this, and that this is a key civil rights issue. If you care about civil rights, you need to care about mass incarceration. Thank you. And then Maria in the back. Oh, sorry, here, and then here. He's been waiting a while, and then Maria in the back, and then over here. Okay.
I am very edified and encouraged to have a theologian in public integrating restorative practices with liturgy and sacraments. And I think we need, we're involved in the intervention aspect of restorative justice in things you've been speaking about tonight. There's also a prevention dimension to restorative justice, which is very effective in schools. And I know Archdiocese of Melbourne, with 300 schools, has now integrated that in social emotional learning in 150 out of 300 schools. I'm wondering what we pick up around here, like Department of Education at a university like this, where are they with social emotional learning and restorative practices?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting innovations with restorative justice is the implementation of restorative justice in schools. There's a great book called The Little Book of Restorative Justice in Schools. It's part of the Little Book series. It's only $5. And it's something that's been picked up piecemeal by school district to school district or school to school. So a few years ago, probably about 8 years ago, the Denver County schools, for instance, instituted restorative justice as their main mode of discipline. There are a couple of programs that I know in Minneapolis that are working on restorative justice in schools, but they could be expanded and they could be much stronger. Even dealing not just with discipline issues, but dealing with conflicts within the school. So for example, some of the conflicts at Washburner South last year seemed like prime occasions for some restorative justice if we could get the right people involved. Restorative justice hasn't been part of the University of St. Thomas in dealing with issues of conflict or of crime committed by students. but there are people who are working on it and who are starting to, in the last month, work out a conversation with Restorative Justice Community Action. Part of the challenge is that all y'all are adults now. It's a lot easier to convince city attorneys to use restorative justice with juveniles than it is with adults. So part of the argument that needs to be made is that tickets for hosting parties, or tickets for urinating on somebody's lawn, or tickets for a number of things that you guys do on the weekends, that those could be sorted out through restorative justice. And so there's some effort to start that at the University of St. Thomas. It requires the partnership with the city attorney's office in St. Paul. Yeah. Maria. Oh, here. Okay. One or the other. Go for it, Maria.
Is the rehabilitation strategy that you're recommending now economically better than what we're currently doing in our prison systems?
Oh, yeah. First, because it works. Part of the expense of prison is that people will return to prison. Rehabilitation is much more effective, especially rehabilitation done in a community setting versus in a prison setting. Not all rehabilitation is effective, though. It has to be properly designed and properly implemented, and it has to be targeted towards particular offenders so that you're doing the right sorts of things with the right sorts of people. As a whole, rehabilitation is much less expensive, mostly because of its effectiveness. The other thing is preventative programs like the Harlem Children's Zone only cost $5,000 per student per year. So for the cost of sending one person to prison for 1 year, we could send 8 children through programs like Harlem Children's Zone. It's way more effective in our use of money. Yeah. Ben?
Since you've had a lot of experience in the criminal justice system, I was just curious, what are some personal examples that you've kind of seen in your work of the restorative justice and kind of the family and community support system kind of working out, perhaps even in our own community, like the Northside Achievement Zone in North Minneapolis?
Yeah.
Can you just expand on that?
Unfortunately, I've seen fewer success cases than real frustrations, mostly because the resources haven't been there. One of the great treasures of my experience, though, was working with the Certificate of Theological Studies Program in Metro State Prison and really getting to know a small group of women prisoners very well. And their crimes were quite serious. Many of them did need to be in prison. The thing that was most heartbreaking to me, I think, was seeing a woman who was developmentally probably 7 years old in prison, severe mental illness problems, severe developmental delays. She had done horrendous things, but prison wasn't the right place for her. And being in prison left her vulnerable to victimization over and over and over again. At the same prison, there was a puppy training program. People need to train puppies to become helper dogs. And they had a program that brought the puppies in. They had their little kennel in the corner, the little puppy prison, a little grown-up prison. And the puppies were around. The women raised them from 6 weeks of age, when they could be separated from their llamas, till they were 1 year. And at that point, the puppies had to leave the prison because they couldn't learn all the skills that they needed to learn to be assistance dogs. Like, you can't learn how to cross a street in a prison, for example. But what was amazing about that program was that it enabled women to get certified as veterinary technicians. It also provided a sense of levity within the prison, and it provided an opportunity to care for something vulnerable. And that these women would light up when one of the dogs appeared. It was amazing to watch. No one who completed that program ever recidivated. And all it took was some dogs. It's relatively inexpensive to do that compared to sending someone to prison over and over again. You can adopt dogs that have been in prison. Many states now have these programs as a jobs or vocation program. And it can either be that they're training assistance dogs or they're working on rehabilitating the dogs that aren't quite ready to be in a family and getting them prepared to do well with children and whatnot. So there are things that are hopeful, but if you spend a lot of time in prison, you'll encounter a lot of cases that are just wrong, and that you'll recognize that the resources are completely inadequate. One more? Yeah. Yeah, so last question, Greta, I think we, yeah.
I feel like I hear many stories about inmates who are like go through this like rehabilitation and they're let out and then they end up back in jail. How is this like an image of God if they keep making the wrong mistakes?
Well, the first thing is that most people don't have any sort of rehabilitation in prison. The shift in the 1970s leading to mass incarceration was based on a rejection of rehabilitation and saying, well, rehabilitation doesn't work, so we'll just punish for the sake of punishment. The sense that rehabilitation doesn't work was based on some really faulty studies, and criminologists have come around to recognize the fault of those studies. One of the faults of the studies is they were counting a whole lot of things as rehabilitation that are not rehabilitative in any way. If you look at the history of prisons and things that have been defined of rehabilitation, it's pretty appalling. The United States, in the early history of prisons, we kind of invented them as a form of punishment. People didn't really use prisons as punishment prior to the early 19th century. And so then we made up penitentiaries and reformatories. And you can look up what counts as rehabilitation within them. So one of the things that counts as rehabilitation is the use of what's called an iron gag, which is a piece of iron about 6 inches long that's used and inserted on your tongue and tied around the back of your throat with chains. And that's called rehabilitation. Another form of rehabilitation was essentially waterboarding. And you can look at 19th century newspapers that depict illustrations of waterboarding. So rehabilitation is a word that can be deeply misused. So we need to be careful about how we use it. And we have to use it selectively for programs that do uphold the dignity of the person. If you're just going in there as a psychologist and experimenting with folks, then you're doing it wrong. It has to be something that's based upon establishing what can enable someone to enter into society and to flourish. But people do reoffend. People do make mistakes. But theologically, the image of God, we can't get rid of it. Since you're in one-on-one with me, we'll go back to Genesis 1 through 11. In Genesis 9:6, God reasserts that these are my people. These are people created in the image of God, and whoever sheds the blood of one has done a grave sin. This is after Eden. This is after Cain and Abel. This is after Noah. So that biblical text points to the fact that despite sin, despite our fallenness, the image of God remains.
very well. I mean, there's a lot of material, but in 45 minutes, there's a very clear picture. And I think right